Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Office Podcast. I'm your host, Hassan, and thank you to everyone for tuning in to the last episode where we discussed Michael Scott, one of my top five characters of The Office. Today, we're going to be talking about another one of my favorites, and that is Jim Halpert. Jim Halpert, for those of you that don't know who he is, I hope you do know who he is because he was a pivotal part of the role. But if you don't know, for the two of you listening right now, Jim Halpert was obviously the office prankster. Would cause havoc around the office. Would pick on Dwight a lot because Dwight was just Dwight. But I had to talk about Jim because Jim's a bit of an interesting character. Jim's a bit of an anomaly for me. I think Jim is the only character, in my opinion, that could have a standalone season. If there was like an origin story of any one of the characters in there, I think Jim would have a very strong sort of presence in the office, which would allow him to have that standalone show. And the reason I say that is because when Jim went away to Stanford, Connecticut, to the other Dunder Mifflin branch, for me, he didn't really need. Obviously, he had Andy, and then he had Karen. But if Jim had not made any friends and had no interactions within that new office, I still think he would have played a big role, a pivotal role. He would have been able to bounce off of his own dialogue. Whereas I feel like someone like Pam wouldn't. She wouldn't be as funny. Someone like Oscar wouldn't. Someone like Angela maybe would be a bit funnier than Pam, but not really. I think Jim definitely would be a strong standalone character in his own show. And just going back to the example of Stanford, Connecticut, I think that was one of the best things to happen for the show. I think it showed that Jim is a very strong character. Jim can work alone, and Jim can engage with other people. So obviously the love interest being Karen, and then Andy almost taking over the part of Dwight, the office idiot, the one that Jim's gonna prank. And I think you got an insight as to Jim's kind of mischievous sort of behavior, especially with someone as new as Andy, because obviously with Dwight he'd been working with him for a few years. Andy he'd literally just met, and he was kind of pranking him already. Jim, for me, as I've said about all of my other favorite characters, Jim has got to be one of my favorite characters because his one-liners are the best, his facial expressions are the best, and I think he held the show together. After Michael Scott left, Jim kind of held the show together for me. It was difficult to see Michael Scott leave. He was the show, in my opinion. He was the show. From season 1 to season 7, it shouldn't have been called The Office. It should have just been called The Michael Scott Show, because that's what it was. I think in my opinion, Michael was. I know Kevin was my favorite, but Michael was the strongest character in the whole show. When he went, there were very big boots to fill, and I don't think having another manager from outside, like e.g., if Will Ferrell for real came in and took over, it wouldn't have been as funny. Him being in the couple episodes he was in was very good. A nice little segue into the new season, but I don't think him being a permanent member of The Office would have worked. Michael Scott, Steve Carell was a completely different character that Jim worked very well with on screen. And I think with D'Angelo Vickers, Jim wouldn't have worked as well with him. So I think for me, Jim is one of the strongest characters with one of the best dialogues, the best storylines, especially later on when he's trying to start his sports marketing company. And he was a big part of the show. Some of the theories and some of the things I picked up on as well is that Jim's one of the most reliable people in the office. If there's anything crazy going on, everyone looks to Jim for answers. Everyone looks to Jim for clarity. And everyone looks to Jim for advice. I think a lot of people have been to Jim for advice. So when Michael thought he was being shaken down by the mob, everyone called Jim and Pam. Probably not so much Pam, but more Jim. And it shows that, he was a very important part to those characters on screen as well. he was their favorite, essentially. You know, when people wanted to do something, they wanted Jim to be a part of it. And for me, I think had Jim left after Michael, I think the show would have died. I think if Jim Halpert had left the show, along with Michael, I think viewerships would have dropped dramatically. And these are the reasons why. Sorry, the reasons why is because Andy was okay, but he wasn't as funny as Michael. I don't think he was as funny as Jim. Dwight was a very, very good character who I'll be talking about later in the series, but I don't think he would have held it together as well as Jim did in the latter seasons. So for me, in that regard, Jim kind of made the show after Michael left, and the character Jim as well, which we can learn as the viewers of the show, of this great show, is that Jim was a great salesman. Jim helped the company a lot, through Michael's tenure as manager. Jim was, I believe, the top selling salesman along with Dwight. But Jim, might have seemed like that counterproductive, cool guy at the office that just wanted to have a laugh and go home. He actually was a very hard worker. One of the seasons where he asks about his commission being capped shows that he was the only one that had met his commission that quarter or whatever it was in that season. So it shows he's a very good salesperson, and he's trusted by Michael a lot to go on sales calls and things like that. When they had to get that paper from Danny Cordray. So that paper company that they were trying to that company they were trying to sell paper to, Dwight and Jim, the two best salesmen of the company, went. So I think for me, Jim definitely was the best salesperson of the show. Dwight was okay. I guess Dwight's record kind of got ruined because he left for Staples. So technically, Jim is the longest running best salesman, because I think he was longer. I think he was there longer than Michael as a salesman, if I remember correctly. I need to probably go back and watch the episode to remind myself of that. And another reason why Jim was my favorite character, I think he was done dirty by Pam. I think Pam treated him very badly. I think early in the show where she led him on, but more later on when he wanted to go chase his dreams of being a sports marketer, wanted to move to Philadelphia, Pam made it very hard for him. Pam, guilt tripped him into staying. Even though he thought he was staying for the right reasons, he wasn't. He allowed her to go pursue her dreams of being in art school and being an artist. He didn't think twice. He was even going to let her do it again because she failed the first time. But with him pursuing the stuff in Philadelphia, she made it an issue. And that's another reason why I don't like Pam Beesly, man. I'm going to get to Pam on one of these episodes, and I'm going to completely break down. I think it's going to be the longest episode of the series, I think, when I break down the reasons why I don't like Pam and the person she is. But anyway, I digress. But he was treated badly by Pam. The person that is meant to he's meant to confide in, the person that is meant to help him. She didn't. She let him walk away from his dream and didn't even bat an eyelid. Yeah, towards the end you could say, oh, she did whatever she did, but the damage had been done by then, And Pam is definitely to blame for a lot of Jim's issues later on in the show. And another thing I really thought about recently after watching the show and Jim kind of being co-manager, I don't think he would have been a good solo manager. I don't think we saw it. I think Joe asked him to be acting manager until they found someone. I don't think he would have been a good manager. I think he would have been distracted a lot. Of course, Michael Scott was, but I think Michael Scott got on with the job because no one really wanted to chill out with him. But I think with Jim, I think the popularity would have got to him. Him being the manager and being so liked by others, he wouldn't have done any work. And him being a manager, he would have had so much more power to prank Dwight and make a fool of him than he did as just a normal salesperson. So yeah, man. If I'm honest, I know I said Kevin was my favorite, and he really is my favorite. Like, Kevin Malone is the best character to ever grace television, and I'll stick by that until my last day. But Jim, honestly, it has to be second for me. Jim is such a strong character. You know, I think very early on, I didn't really like him. He was a bit boring, a bit diluted. But then towards the end of the show, he played a very, very good role. And, you know, I loved him in the show. And, you know, if there was ever a spin off or like a, you know, like an origin story type thing, I would definitely watch it if Jim was in it for sure. And his relationship with Dwight was a bit of a funny one. I think deep down he was maybe jealous of Dwight. You know how you get those kids in school that pick on you because they're jealous of you. I think that's what it was. I think because early on Jim didn't have any passion, and Dwight did. Dwight loved paper. Dwight loved the way he worked. Dwight loved everything about the job, and Jim didn't. Jim felt like there was something missing. And if you notice, even though you know the reason why he wasn't pranked a lot in the latter seasons was because Jim wasn't there. You know, there was an odd prank here and there, but when Jim was in the office, he pranked him a lot because he didn't feel like he didn't feel fulfilled. He didn't feel like he was working to the best of his abilities. And Dwight was. Dwight was a very strong character. Dwight enjoyed exactly what he was doing. He knew what he was doing. He was passionate. And you know, Jim easily could have pranked Dwight from Philadelphia, but he didn't. He chose not to, because finally Jim had found something he loved and was focused on and was passionate about. And Jim finally found who he was when he went to that sports marketing place, which is the reason, again, going back to the point that Jim was jealous of Dwight. And that's hard to believe, but he really was. And, you know, Dwight, again, I've got to do an episode on Dwight. It's going to happen. But Dwight was happier than Jim. It's hard to believe, but he really was happier than Jim. You know, even though Jim, in the eyes of everyone else in the office, had won the lottery in terms of his looks, his success. You know, some would argue that Pam was a catch. I would not say that. But Dwight was happier. Dwight was a lot more fulfilled, and I think that showed throughout. And I think that's one of those nuances you don't pick up on. And I only picked up on it recently that, you know, why is Jim doing that? But he was jealous of Dwight, man. Jim was jealous of Dwight. Who'd ever thought that would happen? But anyways, guys, that is the episode today. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate all the support that everyone is showing me on this podcast. Wherever you're watching this, if you could follow me, like the video or the podcast somehow, share it with your friends, share it with those who love the show as much as we do, that would really help me out. Thank you for listening. I will catch you on the next episode. Peace and love. Take care.